What's up everyone, my name is Cordell, aka Hot Cocoa, and today I'm going to talk about the psychology of competitive music, and really just any type of competitive art. So if you're curious about what it takes to be the best, and how that affects your well-being as a creative and as an artist, then you're in the right place. So let's dive in. Because a lot of people are doing non-competitive creative work and treating it like a competition. People are comparing themselves to other people. They're using external motivations to drive their work forward. And they're just really kind of comparing and putting themselves on pedestals when you're not in a competition. You don't need to do that. Competitive music and competitive art has been on my mind a lot lately because I just competed in the finger drumming world championships this year. I got ranked 3rd place in the world, which is pretty good. I had a lot of fun and I can't wait to go back next year to go for the gold. But I'm not new to performing in this competitive way. I have a really rich history in competitive marching percussion, which takes competition extremely seriously. I was in DCI, which is drum corps, and WGI, which is kind of like percussion theater musical performance, but all of it has judges and score criteria and there's award ceremonies and it's super competitive. But after I kind of got out of this competitive marching percussion world, I went into music production and sound design and creativity coaching, and I really got into a very non-competitive space with music and performing arts. I was in this space for years up until I started to compete in these finger drumming world championships last year and this year. And now I've gotten a really interesting relationship with non-competitive musical creative practice and competitive music and competitive art in general. And today I really want to break down where these two overlap, because each of them have pros and cons. And I think if you've got very little experience with one or the other, that you can really grow a lot as a creative and as an artist if you start to engage with one or the other. So what do I even mean when I say competitive music or competitive art? Really, I'm talking about formal competitions. So in this case, it's when you are paired with other people to be against one another, and you're going for some type of score or points or performance criteria that ends with a zero-sum interaction, which means there's going to be a winner and there's going to be a loser in some way. You can do this individually, you can do this on teams or ensembles. There's so many ways to get into competitive art, whether it's dancing or painting or music. Of course, there's dozens of different kinds of competitive music, and it's all over the world. There's no shortage of competitions, and there's so many different tiers and brackets, from world class to really local to really specific like finger drumming to really broad. There's an unbelievable amount of diversity when it comes to competition with music and art more broadly. This is in contrast to non-competitive art, which means you're not necessarily pitted against someone, you're not really being scored, you're not necessarily trying to win, and there are no losers, but you're still engaging in music or creativity, art in some way. So if we're going to compare and contrast, we're going to need a Venn diagram. Let's dive into it. I'll focus on music, but this really goes for any type of art form. Since they're both creative acts, of course there's going to be a lot of overlap. One of my absolute favorite parts of both competitive music and non-competitive music is just the community that you get. The people that you compete with can often become some of your closest collaborators and artistic inspirations. If you're on a team, those bonds are like no other relationship that you could possibly have when you really train together and compete together and aim for goals as a unit. And then of course in creative communities and other collaborators and people that you're connecting with at shows and performances, all of these relationships can be really vital, and they show up in both competitive and non-competitive art. Your amount of engagement also shows up in both. So you can get deeply lost in rehearsals and practices and training for a competition, and you can get absolutely absorbed in creating works of art that are never going to be compared to other people in a competitive manner. So engagement is deeply involved in both of them. And of course, you can perform in a competitive way or a non-competitive way. So when we're talking about performances and showcases and really helping other people engage with your art, that could be competitive or it could be non-competitive. Those are some of the pros, but there are also cons that are shared by both competitive and non-competitive art. I think one of the big ones is being judged. This one seems like it might be more tied to competition since those tend to have like formal judges, but absolutely judgments are going to happen if you're showcasing your art, even if it's not competitive. Who is doing the judging is going to vary, and we'll get into that in a minute, but just understand that like sometimes it can be good, but generally speaking, judgment can be kind of difficult for most people, and that's going to happen whether you're in a competition or not. Same with anxiety and the pressure that comes with performances. Obviously, if you're going into a competition and it's got high stakes and there's huge audiences and judges, it can cause a lot of anxiety and stress and pressure. Even if you're not competing, you can still get performance anxiety. Even if there are no judges, there's no winners, you can't lose. A lot of times there's still a pressure to perform, whether that comes from extrinsic or intrinsic or whatever. Either way, there's still the chance that anxiety and pressure can show up in your creative work, regardless of the competition status. And finally, one of the big overlaps that I see, which is like kind of not ideal, is having to balance your career with your creative work. Even if that means you're a professional full-time creating music or whatever your art form is, that's still going to be something that you'll need to balance, whether you're competing and you're getting sponsorships and your whole career is competing, or you need to maintain a side job while you're competing. Same with non-competitive work. If that's your entire livelihood is your creative work, there's a lot that needs to be balanced there. And if it's not your entire livelihood, that means you still need to devote resources and time to some other type of resource requiring work to support your creative practice. So either way, you'll need some type of career and way to support yourself, whether you're competitive or not with your creative practice. So those are some of the similarities I see, but I know what you're really here for. Let's get into the differences of what it means to compete with your creative work, and what it means to avoid competition with your creative work. Now, I firmly believe that there are pros and cons to both competition and non-competition, but I want to start with the cons of competitive creative work. A big one is that every competition has to have some kind of rules, and you're kind of boxed in with these particular rules. This helps to keep things even on the playing field when it comes to comparing different kinds of work. There's reasons for the rules, but they inherently limit you. Now, limits aren't necessarily bad for creative work, but in this case, I'm talking about limits of how far you can express yourself. There's really specific boundaries that come with competitions. In the finger drumming world championships I was just in, each round was only 2 minutes long. The final round was 3 minutes. You're only allowed to use 2 controllers at a time with 1 laptop. And these kinds of limitations are important for the structure of the competition, but they're really limiting the way I can express myself. That's actually one of the benefits of non-competitive creativity, is just the creative freedom is so expansive. You can do anything you want. All bets are off. Like, there's no one telling you like you're not allowed to do this or you're disqualified. You can just go crazy. One of the reasons I've been exploring this contrast is because I just finished that competition last weekend, but in a few weeks I have another performance that's in a club here in Berlin that is not a competition, and I'll be playing really similar things. And so I'm really starting to look at the balance and the differences between a competitive hot cocoa performance and a non-competitive hot cocoa performance. But this show that I have coming up in a couple weeks, I can do more than 2 controllers. I could do 10 controllers if I wanted to. In fact, I'm planning on using controllers where I can hit them with sticks, and I'll be using foot pedals and all kinds of crazy things that would be against the rules in the finger drumming world championships. 2 minutes for me is also a really hard rule to stick with, and it forced me to get really creative with how quickly I can express these musical ideas. So I ended up playing something like this. But I think the way I prefer to perform these kinds of things is to really find my groove and just get in the jam and just stick with it for a while. And this is how I want to approach this show coming up in a few weeks that's non-competitive, so that I can just vibe with it like this. Another potential con of competitive music and competitive art is that you have to focus on the technicalities required to win. And this is usually prioritized above creative expression. So what I mean by that is like there's specific criteria that judges are looking at of like the speed that you're playing and the technical technique that you're using to hold your instrument and how precise you are with the rhythms and the melody and the intonation. It depends on the type of musical performance, of course, but there's so many technical details that have to be emphasized in a competitive performance. And this can be really fun, but a lot of times this can be emphasized to the detriment of creative expression. And that's how you get one of the pros of non-competitive performance as well, is that you can just really prioritize expression. When you're not comparing yourself to anyone else, you're not trying to impress any judges or reach any specific criteria, the technical aspects of your performance matter so much less than what you're trying to say and what you're trying to express and how you're getting it out. And people can tell. There's actually been a lot of research on this of kind of blind audiences and judges listening to performers who either play technically perfect or pretend that this is their first time playing it and become a little bit more mindful, ignore the technicalities a little bit, although they're still experts, and they just express themselves and enjoy the piece. People can tell, and people tend to prefer the performances that are expressive, even if they're slightly less technically proficient. But in a competitive state, that technical proficiency is super important, more important than in a non-competitive state. Another potential drawback of competitive music is how it can foster rivalries and you get a competitive us versus them, me versus you mentality. This can motivate you to perform more, but a lot of times it's creating animosity and it pushes you away from other people. And this is really in contrast to how collaborative non-competitive art can be, where there is no winner or loser. It's not like I have to win, so you have to lose. You can just collaborate with people much more easily. You can support other people who are also doing great things. You can see other people's wins as your wins. If an artist I love books a huge show, that doesn't mean I lose. It means that I'm succeeding in that I can swim in their wake in a sense, and I can celebrate their wins in a way that is a little bit more difficult to do if you're in a competitive environment. But in a non-competitive environment, collaboration becomes so much easier and it just builds relationships and allows you to flourish within a community in a way that competitive creativity can be a little bit more difficult to do. This is a non-exhaustive list. I'm sure you can come up with many. I want to hear about them in the comments. But one of my last things I've got here as a potential con for competitive music and art is an other comparison in which you're comparing yourself to other people. This is inherent and embedded in a competition, and this is actually really difficult for your self-esteem and your identity when you're creating your sense of self by comparing how you're doing to other people. Psychologists call this an ego orientation, where your self-concept is wrapped up in how you stack up with other people. This can boost your self-esteem if you end up coming out on top, but a lot of times it'll just make you feel less than and inadequate, and it's just not great for your well-being. This is in contrast to non-competitive art, in which you can compare yourself to yourself. This self-comparison helps you with what psychologists call a mastery orientation, where instead of focusing on how you compare to other people, you compare yourself to past versions of yourself. So you see how much you've improved and how much skills you've gained and how much more your perspective on your work has changed. This mastery orientation is really motivating and exciting. And it's one of the best parts about non-competitive creativity, because you can just see how far you've grown, and that itself is the beauty. And you don't have to involve other people on different journeys with different bodies and backgrounds and cultures and resources. It's just so removed from your own creative practice. And so when you compare yourself to yourself, you see your own sense of mastery. That's one of the best things that I've been able to take away from my own non-competitive creative practice. So I know it kind of sounds like I'm glorifying non-competitive art right now, but there are potential cons in non-competitive art too. One of the main ones that I've seen is that when you're not competing and you're just making art for art's sake, it's harder to find guiding principles and standards and benchmarks for the way that you're performing. You can of course look at other similar artists, but again, if everyone's just expressing themselves and doing whatever they want, the doors are so wide open that it's hard to tell like where the cutting edge of the field can be. Whereas in a competitive space, everyone knows exactly where the cutting edge is because that's who's been ranked the highest in that particular field. And you know the other techniques that are being used, and you can kind of see these standards appear in these techniques that have become like the most effective in whatever you're trying to do. So for me, for example, it's like how fast do people actually drum, or how many samples are being triggered, and what kind of techniques are people using. When you start to understand these standards, you can actually push past them. And this is one of the benefits of competitive music, is it helps you find the standard so that you can push the envelope and go further and further and really evolve the entire culture and the medium that you're engaging with. I mentioned earlier that both competitive and non-competitive art involves you getting judged, but when you're doing non-competitive art, a lot of that judgment comes from people who are not experts. It can come from your fans and your audience, or I don't know, executives and label folk who aren't necessarily musical experts. And this feedback can often just be really general. It's just like, yeah, I don't really like this vibe, or like, yeah, you've got it. And these kind of things where there's not a lot of substance to the feedback you're getting. And that can be hard to figure out how to use it and make it constructive and this kind of thing. But this is in contrast to competitive art and competitive musical spaces. The feedback you get are from experts and judges who know a ton about musical performance and technical skill and the field itself and the culture and the history. And the feedback that you can get in competitive spaces can often be really specific, really constructive, and really directly applied to your creative practice, especially when you involve coaches and teachers, which of course you can do in a non-competitive space, but in competitive spaces, your coaches and your teachers can be really, really integral to like winning, and the feedback that you get in those cases can be directly applied in a competition. So you can see how what you're training and what you're building directly translates to your performance. I know I said that both styles of creating and performing can build communities, but what I've seen in my experience and the people that I've coached and been around is that non-competitive art and music can often be a little isolating. Doesn't have to be, especially if you're in a band or a collective or something, but a lot of times non-competitive art is just being alone in a room making music or doing your practice, and you're just kind of removed from other people until you perform. Whereas in a competitive space, you're directly in conversation and in relation with other people who are doing really similar work. Not only are you in conversation and relation with other people, but there are avenues for public recognition. This is one of the main benefits that I see of competitive art, is you actually get to have these really defined accomplishments and achievements that are recognized by people in the field, and that carry some weight even if people aren't in the field. So when I say I got third in the world for finger drumming, even if you don't know what finger drumming is, you can still be kind of impressed in some sense, or recognize that there is some kind of accomplishment there. Whereas when you're doing non-competitive creative work, it's a little bit harder to get that recognition. It's not impossible, but it can be a little bit more difficult to really see the clear-cut accomplishment and recognition that comes directly out of your work. And finally, when you're doing non-competitive creative work, it can be really hard to find external rewards. Now, we already mentioned with the mastery orientation that there's a lot of intrinsic motivation with non-competitive work, and you're just doing it for the love of it and for getting better and for gaining wisdom and ability and fostering your curiosity. There's a lot of intrinsic motivation, but the extrinsic motivation, although it's not as vital as intrinsic motivation in terms of creative process and well-being, it is still motivating. And this is something that competitive creative work has in spades. There's so many external motivators, from that recognition that we mentioned earlier, and actually getting awards and trophies and titles, and just like holding the victory itself is an extrinsic motivator. When you win, you get free stuff. Thanks, Yamaha. Got this for being in the top 3. This is an external motivator. Wasn't the reason I competed, but it is definitely adding to the motivation of winning, because I know I'm going to get a bunch of free stuff. So ultimately, I kind of land in the middle. There's aspects of competing that I absolutely adore and made me who I am today. But there's a lot of times when I don't want to compete and I want to collaborate and I don't want to compare myself to others. I don't want to be scored and judged. I just want us all to express ourselves and have some fun. And I would say if you're not familiar with one side of this, you should definitely explore it, because there's a lot of benefits to both. But be careful, because leaning too far into each one of these could potentially have some downfalls. If you only take one thing away from this video, I want you to know which side of this Venn diagram you're on. Because a lot of people are doing non-competitive creative work and treating it like a competition. People are comparing themselves to other people. They're using external motivations to drive their work forward. And they're just really kind of comparing and like putting themselves on pedestals when you're not in a competition. You don't need to do that. If you're not competing, you're not ranking yourself against other people, then just don't compete. You can just bask in the spoils of non-competitive creative work. Compare yourself to yourself and just have fun with it. But if you are competing, you can lean into that and take it seriously and enjoy all the benefits that come with trying to be the best and taking a competitive stance so that you can get recognized for your expertise and your ability. Both sides of the coin will allow you to flourish, and as you explore, you can start to figure out where you lean and find a balance for yourself. You don't have to compete, and you can only compete if you want to. But either way, I want you to go out there and enjoy your creative work and be the best at that. If you thought this video was helpful, make sure you hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, comment down below how you feel about competition and creative work. It's such an interesting relationship, and I think it goes way further than the topics that I mentioned here. If you want to explore more about creativity and music, you can check out the rest of my channel where I've got a bunch of really interesting creative explorations, as well as really practical tips for finger drumming and e-drumming and Ableton producing. And you can check the link down below to check out my Patreon, where I've got a bunch of project breakdowns. I also have a lot of creativity resources on upwardacts.com, where I've got podcasts and articles and all kinds of fun stuff that'll help you create in a way that you absolutely love. Until next time, peace.